The short clip of audio you just listened to was a transcription of Hey Soul Sister by the band Train. Here's that transcription again. And here's the original audio.
Your lipstick stains on the front lobe of my left side brain.
Listening to that transcription, you probably thought to yourself, well, that was okay at best, and I totally agree with you. However, what makes that transcription interesting is not its quality, but that it was entirely generated by a computer algorithm. Today we're going to answer the question, can a computer understand music? And by understand music, I don't mean to write or enjoy or understand music in the sense that you and I would use the word. By understand music, I mean if I give a computer a specific recording of audio, would it be able to take that and interpret it and convert it into sheet music? As I walk you through an algorithm I developed to do this, we'll see this is not too difficult for humans, but surprisingly hard for a computer. Case in point, here's another transcription done by my algorithm. Could you guess what song that was? Call Me Maybe by Carly Rae Jepsen.
Hey, I just met you, and this is crazy.
Getting a computer to understand music is a very difficult task, and even with the most cutting-edge techniques, you won't always get it right. So the first thing we'll do today is tackle a much simpler question. Let's say you're clapping at a consistent beat. The speed of those beats is called the tempo, and before we're able to transcribe whole sheets of music, we'll first have to find a tempo. For constant claps, that's pretty easy. Whenever we clap, we get a big spike in volume. We can take each of those spikes, find the average time between them, and from there calculate the tempo. Analyzing my own clapping, you can see that each clap has just about 0.9 seconds between them. So that's 1 beat per 0.9 seconds, just about 66 beats per minute. Beats per minute, or BPM, is just the standard unit for tempo. And now notating that into sheet music using a library called Lilypon looks something a bit like this. I've chosen for the music to play the note C at every beat, even though clapping doesn't necessarily have a note associated with it. Now, one tiny detail I skipped over was how exactly we're finding those spikes. A naive way to do it would be to record whenever the volume is above a certain threshold. This almost works, but now when we introduce a little bit of noise to our audio, the volume crosses the threshold multiple times and our computer detects multiple beats when there should really only be one. There are a lot of ways to tackle this issue, so keep that in mind as we make our clapping a little bit more complex now. Now I've added a little bit of rhythm to my clapping. We can use the same method as before to find spikes in volume, but we cannot use the same averaging technique to find the tempo. Actually, it is still that same underlying tempo of 66 beats per minute. We've just added a clap in between some of the beats. So what do? One way to approach this problem is to use autocorrelation. Take your original audio and duplicate it. Now offset it a little bit and compare it to the original signal. In practice, this comparison is usually done with a multiplication between the two signals. Now, as you slowly change the offset, if your audio is periodic or has a repeating pattern, in our case, our beats, then you'll see strong spikes at certain offsets. For our rhythmic clapping, we get that maximum offset at around 0.9 seconds, which gives us our 66 beats per minute, as we expected. Before we can get this written to sheet music, we have to find a way to notate our new types of notes, in this case, quarter and eighth notes. To do that, we'll make a little chart with times we should expect each type of note to take based on our tempo. For example, our quarter note, we expect that to be just 1 beat, so it's going to be 0.9 seconds. Then, when we track the times between spikes and volumes, as we did before, we can compare each of those times to our chart, figure out what note it should be, and write that to our sheet music. Now, to fully complete our explanation, let's look at the specifics of how we're tracking those spikes in volume. The way we do that is not by comparing our audio to a fixed threshold, as I suggested earlier, but to a local threshold. This local threshold is done by finding all the local minimum in our audio and setting thresholds between each pair of minimums. For example, if you take a look at this area of the graph, you can see we have two local minimum here. Since the local minimum on the right side is higher than the one on the left, we'll set the threshold based on that. A simple scheme for the threshold might be to always set it 2 units above the higher local minimum. And with this threshold, we can see the peak is right here. In this other area, the threshold is set by the left minimum. However, since no point crosses the threshold in this local area, we find no peak here. With that, we can now notate any sort of complex beat. All we have to do is expand our chart to include triplets, 16th notes, and anything else we want. So far, we have some sense of rhythm established for simple clapping, but what happens when we're playing actual notes, like on a violin? Now when we look at the volume, it remains constant, so clearly what we did with volume before is not going to work. But before I present a solution for this, it'd probably be beneficial to talk about what sound is and how hearing works. One of the earliest forms of ears was called the statokist, and its main function was for balance, but it had some function to detect changes in pressure, which would eventually become what we call hearing. However, at that moment, the function was very limited, just like our algorithm for clapping. It could tell those early organisms whether there was a change in air pressure, but it couldn't distinguish between different types of sounds. But despite those limits, it was still very useful in detecting the presence of some organism nearby. So how do modern ears tell sounds apart? Well, if we look at the air pressure a little more carefully, we can see that it kind of looks like sine waves. So if we understand sound and air pressure as sine waves, then we can interpret that those early ears were only able to track the amplitude of those waves, or the volume. However, amplitude isn't the only characteristic of a sine function. It also has a frequency. A classic example is the 440 Hz note A. You hear this note when the sine wave, or the air pressure, oscillates at 440 Hz, or once every 2.3 milliseconds. So that explains how we're able to hear basic notes. But what about a more complex sound? What if our early organism wants to hear something like a branch snapping? Fortunately, sounds don't have to be a single sine wave. In fact, most sounds are composed of many different sine waves with many different frequencies all added together. At this point, you probably realize that just looking at the air pressure graph doesn't give us much of an intuition for sound anymore. In fact, it's pretty much impossible just looking at the air pressure graph to tell what frequencies are composing that sound. So we might develop this new representation of sound called the spectrogram. Instead of measuring the air pressure at each point in time, our spectrogram is like a recipe to build our timeline of air pressure. Actually, the spectrogram is a 3D graph, but generally for ease of viewing, that third dimension is represented by color. This is what a slice or a vertical column of that spectrogram looks like in 2 dimensions. Each column in our spectrogram represents which sine waves we need to add up to get back to our air pressure. For example, if we take this spectrogram, it says to add up some 440 Hz, some 880 Hz, some 1320 Hz, and the result is that it sounds like a violin. And from our spectrogram, it's also very intuitive to know how our sound is composed. This spectrogram tells us that this is a chord with some 440 Hz A and some 262 Hz C. Going back to our sheet music, if we look at the volume, we don't see any changes. But on the spectrogram, we can see those differences in frequency. Usually, if we as humans are able to see something, then the computer is going to be able to distinguish it as well. We just have to establish what underlying procedure we as humans are using to find that difference. Wait a second. We can just take a difference. To see what I'm talking about, let's look at a constant note A. When we take a difference here, every single slice of the spectrogram is exactly the same. So the difference just cancels everything out to 0. And we detect no changes in notes here. Okay, but now we're sliding to a new note. And now consecutive slices of the spectrogram are just slightly different. So when we subtract those, we'll get something non-zero. When we apply this transform across our whole piece of audio, we get something that looks like this. Deja vu, huh? Looks exactly like our claps. So now, we just apply the same exact algorithm we use for clapping. Remember, this is just the rhythm and not the actual notes themselves. Let's look at some examples. Here's the Darth Vader theme. Here's Pirates of the Caribbean. And can you guess which song this rhythm comes from? Now that we have a rhythm established, let's try to add the actual notes to our sheet music. A simple way to do this might be to just sample between each of our beats. For example, if we look back at our spectrogram, we detected beats right here and right here. So we could just read this slice of the spectrogram halfway in between, find the most prominent frequency, and set that as our note. This somewhat works, but it's not the best way. In real music, there's often imperfections. Maybe the singer was just a little bit out of tune, or maybe they're using a technique called vibrato where they change the frequency of the note to make it sound a little more warm. When we sample just a single frame, there's a high probability that we're sampling some of those imperfections and we get a bad reading. A better way is to take some sort of average. We'll take all the slices between these two timestamps, find the strongest frequency in each one, and whatever the median frequency is, we'll take that to be the right one. Doing that, we can get some actual music playing, like and wait a minute, why are we only playing such simple songs? Alright, chords. Chords are when multiple notes are played at the same time, usually referring to the same instrument playing all of those notes. But for the sake of this video, chords also refer to the fact that pretty much all music will have multiple instruments playing at the same time. To add chords, we'll have to find a way to average multiple different values at once. What does that even mean? Take this simple two-note chord and its spectrogram. In the previous iteration of our algorithm, we only found the most prominent note in each slice, so we'd have completely thrown this top note away. If we do try to keep both notes, then taking an average is even less representative because now our average is somewhere in between both of those notes. We need some sort of statistical method that can capture both notes. Introducing median cut. Literally split your dataset into two by the median and take the average of each half. Simple and gets the job done for just two notes. What if we have 3, 4, or 5? How can we dynamically adjust to having more notes? What we need are bubbles. What the heck, bubbles? Well, think about it. When we have two bubbles just floating separately, they're just going to continue minding their own business. But when we squeeze two bubbles together, they'll merge into a single bubble. Now, if we take all of our data points and turn them all into bubbles, look, all the bubbles that are really close together merge into one. And what we're left with is our 3 distinct notes. In practice, in order to merge the bubbles, main shift clustering will make each point a bubble, as we said. Then it takes each bubble and finds all the points that are inside that bubble. It finds the center of all of those points and moves the bubble to that new location. Then all the bubbles that are moved to the same point get merged together, and it repeats until it can't merge any more bubbles. Actually, this explanation of main shift clustering with bubbles turns out to stem from a much deeper connection to Voronoi cells of all things. How did these things manage to show up in an algorithm for turning audio into sheet music? Isn't that just crazy? So now we have chords, and let's listen to a few transcriptions.
I wish you bluebirds in the spring to give your heart a song to sing. It isn't over.
In this video, I've shown you a lot of examples of the transcriptions working. But if you recall from the beginning of the video, sometimes our algorithm fails pretty catastrophically. So let's talk about some of the limitations of our algorithm, like with Call Me Maybe by Carly Rae Jepsen. Actually, if you listen closely to the transcription, you can kind of hear what sounds like drums. And listening to the original song, you can hear that those drums are there as well.
Hey, I just met you, and this is crazy.
Because human ears are less receptive to low frequencies, music producers will tend to boost those frequencies, and that's good for the listening experience, but not for a computer trying to turn audio into sheet music. We can try to tackle individual problems like this, but human hearing actually turns out to be quite complex. By some estimates, the audio cortex of your brain is almost as large as the visual cortex. And that makes the overall question of having a computer understand music a very difficult question. But not to be too drab, let's end this video with some examples of the algorithm working. Thanks for watching, subscribe if you liked the video, and see you next time.